Hello dear viewer, welcome back to my channel. I'm Zoe and here we like to rummage around the attics of fashion history and see what we can plunder. I got about 20 seconds into my first event as a 14th century reenactor before realising that my beloved wicker baskets just weren't cutting the mustard. I want a bag. I used a combination of Pinterest, Google and reverse image searching when I found something I was interested in to pin down the approximate style and colour palette appropriate to the era, which is the 1300s. I then spent a very enjoyable week trawling through the internet archives of a lot of primary source manuscripts, especially the British Library, the Bodleian Library, the Morgan Library and the VA Digital Archives collection. This bag is rather anachronistically known as a pilgrim's bag by historians and reenactors alike, due to how ubiquitous this bag style is in depictions of pilgrims and religious figures in surviving artworks and manuscripts. One reliable thing I like to do is look for psalters, Bibles and books of hours, as they often depict daily life with contemporary fashions. It's worth noting that biblical figures are often depicted slightly differently to contemporary characters, so that can make dating what they're wearing a little bit interesting. You do have to cross-reference what you're seeing in manuscripts to surviving physical textile records. Both my source notes and my Pinterest boards and formal references will be available for free on my website and my Patreon blog, which are linked in the description box below as always. The scallop shell is commonly associated with this kind of bag and indeed with pilgrimages themselves. It acts as a visual shorthand in artwork to indicate that a person or a group is on a pilgrimage, as well as in real-life medieval society. Of course, it's difficult to equate how common something would have been to see day to day versus how commonly it was depicted in manuscripts, because you see a lot of dragons in manuscripts and you don't see a lot of them day to day. It would be erroneous to suggest that manuscripts are 100% reliable as a source material. What is a pilgrim and why do they have bags? A pilgrimage is basically when you set out on a journey to go somewhere or do a task with religious significance. Pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was a pretty perilous affair. Travel in general was fraught with dangers from robbery, mugging, diseases, the plague being a rather big deal in the 14th century. And the fact that language and religious differences could lead to sometimes deadly altercations. The medieval pilgrim was a bit of a sitting duck for anyone planning to rob them. They couldn't just pop to a bank and get access to more funds if they ran out, so they'd often carry relatively large amounts of money with them. In order to protect themselves, pilgrims had a variety of options, one popular one being pilgrims' badges, and various items of clothing that would mark them out as someone who is or has completed a pilgrimage. The theory being that this would evoke God's protection from anyone or anything wishing to do them harm, in an era where Christianity was fundamentally in the everyday lives of society. This was a rather double-edged sword. It singled them out as people potentially carrying valuables, worth nicking if you didn't mind risking the wrath of God. The Knights Templar, so beloved in popular culture today, were originally established as an order to protect people travelling on pilgrimage against the very real dangers of travel in the Holy Land, especially in the 12th to 13th century. When the Holy Lands became back under Muslim control, we do see a decline in the depiction of pilgrims' bags into the later parts of the 14th century, so the later 1300s, but you do still see them. People are still going on pilgrimages. They'll go on pilgrimages to Europe. They might go on a pilgrimage site to see a specific relic. Pilgrims' badges and pilgrims were everywhere. You still get pilgrims today. Well, not every pilgrim would have carried a pilgrim's bag, and not every pilgrim's bag was possessed by a pilgrim. It's safe to say that these are pretty popular little gadgets if you are a 14th century guy. I self-drafted my pattern based on my favourite 14th century examples in artwork. I noticed in manuscripts bags generally were no more than like 2 hand widths wide and around 1.5 hand widths deep on average. Yes, I measured them. Don't ask how long that took. In the end, it worked out pretty great. I ended up with something I'm really pleased with. I will put the dimensions up on the screen. You can make your own should you want to. It's highly unlikely that someone in the lower classes would own silk or velvet bags for use, if at all, and so I went with wool. I selected this dark red tabby woven wool because I scored 2 moth damage remnants for £1.50 each and had fabric left over from making my hose. The rich saturated colour here is replicable in period using natural dye techniques, but would potentially be a little bit more costly than a paler red. Madder dyed wool is commonly identified in textile deposits of the era in England, notably in London. I believe that this wool has been dyed synthetically, but it will do the job adequately for what I need. I lined the bag with a lightweight green linen left over from a previous sewing project. I had to piece both the wool and the linen lining, but piecing is period and I have fabric waste, so I really don't mind that. I did unfortunately have to embroider over a couple of moth holes, but honestly I like the discreet mend because it makes my bag look a little bit more worn in and slightly less like a costume piece. I did consider doing a more elaborate embroidery rather than a mend. There were sumptuary laws in place in England during this time regarding who was and who was not allowed to wear embroidered clothing, which, depending on who was king at the time, was enforced to varying degrees over the 14th century. I haven't been able to find out if these rules would extend to bags, but as the majority of manuscript examples are a single colour, often featuring 3 tassels, I chose to go for a simpler style of bag for now. I constructed the bag using a running back stitch to sew the lining for the back and flap together as one, leaving the bottom open, before turning the back section with the flap inside out and giving it a good press with the iron so that all of the seams were enclosed for the flap of the bag. To add the front of the bag to make our little pouch, what I did was I turned in the green layer and the red layer into each other, and then when I was sewing the seams, I sewed all 4 turned in edges together. This was a technique I've observed with surviving textile fragments, as instead of sewing 2 seams by hand, you only sew 1. This is done with a whip stitch, or kind of like an overcasting stitch. It means that my outer and my lining are sewn together at the same time, which basically saves on labour. You gotta remember there are no sewing machines in period. To make the straps, I cut long pieces of the red wool, approximately 3 or so inches wide, which was simply the widest amount that I could manage with the wool remnant size that I have. I then sewed them by hand and tried doing the medieval way of seam finishing by polishing them with a rock, which, while perhaps not as effective as the modern iron, was rather more portable. Although I don't think me and my steam iron are parting ways anytime soon. With each bit of the strap now pieced together and the seam allowances turned in, I whip stitched along the outside. I have chosen to do this way of seam finishing rather than doing an internal seam finish and then turning it inside out, mostly because I find that wool tends to stick to itself, and turning out skinny little straps like this is an absolute nightmare. I then gave it a little pin and tried it on in front of a mirror before deciding the length and placement for my straps, and then I whip stitched them in. I like this seam finishing because it controls raw edges and I didn't need to do anything extra to the ends of the strap. While I could have done the straps enclosed internally so that they weren't visible, I wanted to make sure that this was adjustable, so I left a little bit more length of strap than I actually needed sewn into the interior of the bag. So should the strap ever need to be lengthened or shortened for a different owner, it can easily be done. thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you let me know in the comments, and feel free to like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you for another video.